It was only a matter of time until we finally have to discuss this book right here. Yeah, this one. The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. The underlying assumption, the departure point for this whole conversation is going to be the nihilistic hypothesis. The nihilistic hypothesis says that life has no meaning, that there is no purpose to our human existence, that we are the flotsam and jetsam of an oblivious abyss. You might feel uncomfortable with that assumption. Many people feel uncomfortable with that assumption. And if so, then maybe this video isn't for you. We'll start by reading the essay, figuring out what it says, and then by criticizing it and asking, does it really stand up to scrutiny? Yes or no? Okay. So, I have the essay here. How does it start? Quote, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards." End quote. And so that is obviously a super strong way to start an essay. We're going to skip a bit. Camus goes on to say that this question has never really been dealt with seriously, so he wants to rectify that. And then he tells a really disturbing story, and just content warning, this is a disturbing discussion about suicide. Quote, "Of an apartment building manager who had killed himself. I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed greatly since, and that experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. The worm is in man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity in the face of existence to flight from light." End quote. And so this has to go down as one of the most disturbing sentences in any nonfiction essay. It's like, it really feels like Camus is romanticizing suicide, which is a horrible thing, in my opinion. I sort of shudder at the thought. He's describing this guy who committed suicide, and he says to think is to begin to be undermined. That lucidity, that thinking clearly about our human condition, suggests to the mind this idea of suicide. So what do we make of this? Well, we can sort of temper the implications of those sentences by pointing out that by the end of this essay, Camus is going to say that suicide is not an option. It's not a good option. He would probably describe it as cowardice by the end of this essay. And in other places, in the preface to this version, he says very explicitly that suicide is not an option. And I think it's also relevant to know that this was written when Camus was living under the Nazi occupation of France. And I think it's worth reading with the perspective that Camus literally saw his world collapse all around him. He witnessed one of the most horrific things that anyone can endure, the sort of conquering of your country by an imperialist fascist dictatorship. And I imagine that Camus and his friends really did contemplate suicide for that reason. So where does Camus go from here? It's a long essay. And this next part, the main part of the essay, is very long and it's very dense. And I'm just going to mostly skip over it. I mean, I've read it I've read it quickly. I didn't really have patience for it. It is like a dense philosophical treatise where Camus is in a really erudite conversation with the philosophical predecessors. You know, he's talking about the phenomenology of Husserl. He's talking about Kierkegaard. He talks about Nietzsche in there. He's going deep into these like philosophical texts and using a lot of like terminology, you know. But in brief, and if you read through the section, what Camus is describing, what he's discussing, is this idea of the absurd, which in the writing of Camus is like a philosophical term, which reflects this conflict, this tension between man's need and desire to find meaning in his life, in his world, and the total absence of meaning in the universe. And so he describes this as a very unpleasant feeling. And so he, again, goes on to describe different ways that people can respond to this, and, you know, sort of how Kierkegaard responded to it and other people. And those aren't such interesting solutions to me. You could read the essay, you can read summaries of the essay if you want more details on this section. But what I am interested in is the final part of this essay, which is the most famous part, the most well-known, the most memorable part of this essay. And that is when Camus presents us with the image of Sisyphus, who, of course, we all know was punished by the gods to ceaselessly roll a boulder up and down a mountain for all of eternity. So it's like the symbol of like meaninglessness, of futility, and like struggling to do something which has no purpose. And of course, for Camus, that is the metaphor, the ultimate metaphor for our own lives. Now, I just think it's important to point out that Camus was not the first person to focus and present this metaphor for human life. I think it's worth noting that Herman Melville in Moby Dick has a passage where he too reflects and has something to say about the Sisyphusian repetitive aspect of human life. And I want to read that quote right now. This is our narrator, Ishmael, the narrator of Moby Dick, talking to us. And he describes how they had to catch a whale, and there's like a whole involved process where they like harpoon it and attach it to the ship, and they have to like take out the sperm, and it's like extremely messy, and they mess up the entire ship. It's like super dirty, and they extract the valuable sperm, and then they have to like clean the whole ship. And then they do it again. They find a new whale, and it's like this arduous, intense process that they just repeat and repeat. So Ishmael, our narrator, says, quote, "Oh, my friends, but this is man-killing. Yet this is life. For hardly have we mortals, by long toilings, extracted from this world's vast bulk its small but valuable sperm, and then, with weary patience, cleansed ourselves from its defilements, and learned to live here in clean tabernacles of the soul. Hardly is this done, when there she blows, the ghost is spouted up, and away we sail to fight some other world, and go through young life's old routine again." End quote. And so that is the image of Sisyphus, the image of the repetitive meaninglessness of life in Moby Dick. So what does Camus do with this image of Sisyphus? Where does he leave us? He ends the essay with the famous, surprising injunction that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. So let's see that now. Quote, this is Albert Camus writing, "I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." End quote. Now, do we agree with Camus? Does this make sense? Speaking for myself, it did at one point. I mean, I used to love this essay when I was younger. And yeah, it really spoke to me. You know, I think it's easy to see the world through that lens, you know, of Sisyphus. In fact, it reminds me a bit of Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche, in his writing, explored a very similar idea. He's someone who suffered tremendously in his own personal life, and he saw himself as like a kind of Superman, Ubermensch, who endorsed and was happy with his suffering and his life. And of course, he was obviously very atheistic, and he accepted this idea of the absurdity, the meaninglessness of his life, but he also endorsed this idea of the eternal recurrence, that life is like, you know, we should embrace every moment of it, of our life, and we should want to do it again when it's all over. But now, I mean, Nietzsche and Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, it doesn't resonate anymore with me. I don't see myself as a kind of Sisyphus. I don't see myself as an Ubermensch, as a Nietzschean Superman. I don't think I'm like Jesus Christ, who's, you know, so superior to other people and embraces suffering and toil. I don't think it's compelling to imagine Sisyphus happy. That just doesn't really work with me. In real life, I think people need to have things that give their lives meaning. In real life, we need meaningful relationships, meaningful hobbies and projects and goals. These things are very important. Without them, I think human beings tend to be miserable. But we don't necessarily need an overarching meaning the way Camus thinks we do. I mean, in my own personal experience and in the experience of people that I know, if our day-to-day life is filled with meaningful things, then a meaningless life in a godless universe isn't such a big deal. And the whole premise of Camus' essay just is so uncompelling to me. This idea that there's like this gripping, pressing philosophical question. Should we not commit suicide? It's just not true. It's just not true. Like, no one's grappling with that question. I mean, there are people who are grappling with the question of suicide, obviously. But it's not philosophy. It's not the absurd. It's not like you've been undermined by lucidity the way Camus wants us to think. It's just not true. It's not true to human experience. It's not true to lived experience. If we accept Camus' basic premise, this nihilistic hypothesis, where did Camus go wrong? Why are his conclusions so divergent from our lived experience? What's the alternative? And so I want to suggest an alternative reading of the human condition, an alternative metaphor, which in my opinion is more compelling. And it was described hundreds of years before Albert Camus by a one William Shakespeare. In Macbeth, through the character of Macbeth, quote, he's describing the human condition. Macbeth is describing human life as follows, quote, we are a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. End quote. And so it's also a recognition, it's also an endorsement of this nihilistic hypothesis. But man isn't this Christ-like martyr figure who's rolling this boulder and is courageously standing up against the absurdity of his fate. Because man is an idiot. Man is not a philosopher. He's not an Ubermensch. He's just an idiot. He's just going through his day-to-day life, his meaningless life, and he has no insight. He has no perspective. He's not troubled the way Camus thinks we should all be troubled. The author, who in my opinion best embodied this perspective, is Samuel Beckett, who lived around the same time as Camus and dealt with similar themes of meaninglessness. One day, I hope to discuss on this channel my favorite Beckett book of all time, one of my favorite books of all time, which is his book Malloy. But today is not that day. Today, I'm going to discuss his most famous work, the first work by Samuel Beckett that I ever read, which is his play, Waiting for Godot. In Waiting for Godot, we meet two characters on a stage, Vladimir and Estragon, and they're in sort of this surreal, barren landscape. It's like a landscape of the mind, and they're just waiting, as the title implies, for this character, Godot. At one point, they get visited by these two other characters who are passing through, Pozzo and his slave Lucky, and they have some sort of dialogue back and forth. And at the end of Act 1 and Act 2, there's another character, this boy who comes on stage to reassure Vladimir and Estragon that even though Godot couldn't make it today, he'll definitely be here tomorrow. And that's the play. What makes this play so compelling to me, and the reason I think it serves as such a profound metaphor for our own human existence. Vladimir and Estragon, they have a vague sense that something is wrong, that there's something messed up about their world, about their universe, about their lives, but they can't put their finger on it, and they can ignore it. There's a scene in Act 1 when Pozzo and Lucky are coming through, and they're looking for a way to pass the time together. And so they say, oh, as a way to pass the time, we can have Lucky the slave philosophize, or think, actually. We can have him think. And they say, okay, that'd be interesting. So Pozzo, the slave master, tells Lucky, his slave, to think. And then Lucky pours forth with like this torrent of like pressed speech of like anti-philosophy. And what I mean by anti-philosophy is like in the same way you have like anti-jokes. It's like, it sounds like philosophy. It sounds like he's saying something deep, but it's like nonsense. It's like a parody of philosophy. And I read that personally as a satire of the kind of project that Camus is engaged in and Camus' predecessors are engaged in. After Vladimir and Estragon encounter Pozzo and Lucky in Act 1, Pozzo says he needs to go with his slave Lucky because he's, I think, selling his slave, if I'm not mistaken. And so they say goodbye so that Pozzo can go. So here's the scene. An amazing scene, one of my favorite scenes in the whole play. Estragon says to Pozzo, then adieu. And then Pozzo responds, adieu. And then Vladimir chimes in, adieu. And then Pozzo responds to Vladimir, adieu. And then the stage direction is silence. No one moves. Then Vladimir says, adieu. And then Pozzo says, adieu. And then Estragon says, adieu. And then the stage direction, silence. Then Pozzo says, and thank you. And Vladimir says, thank you. And Pozzo says, not at all. Then Estragon, yes, yes. Then Pozzo, no, no. Vladimir, yes, yes. Estragon, no, no. Silence. Then Pozzo says, I don't seem to be able to depart. End quote. And it's such an amazing scene for me because it's an example of the human imagination, the human rationality outstripping, moving beyond the horizon of our freedom. We can imagine doing things, we can want to do things that we can't do. And we don't know why we can't do them. We're just trapped. We're limited. As human beings, we're limited. The range of possibilities before us is circumscribed in ways that we don't understand. If I wanted to put this in conversation with Albert Camus, and I wanted to, talk to Camus and say, listen, this is why I think your ideas are out there and not compelling. We can imagine, Albert Camus and his philosopher friends sitting down, and they've wrote the essay, and they've decided, philosophically speaking, suicide is like a perfectly rational thing to do. And they're like, okay, let's do it. Let's do it. And then they're like, I don't seem to be able to do it because we're not free. We're not free to make certain decisions. For people who aren't battling depression, it's not an option. It's just not. And not for any philosophical reason. It's just not an option. We're limited. Act 2 of Waiting for Godot is much darker than Act 1. It's a really bleak act. Vladimir and Estragon, they sort of wake up, they find themselves, and they don't know when the events of Act 1 happened. And they want to know, was it yesterday that they met Pozzo and Lucky? And they're just like lost, and they're trying to sort of get a grip on their reality. And they end up coming across Pozzo, and he's blinded. And he's without his slave Lucky. When Vladimir finds Pozzo, he's like in a ditch and blind. And Vladimir just wants to know, did we see you yesterday? Because you get the sense that he's just trying to get a grip on his reality. Like he's trying to understand his experience. And so he's asking Pozzo, tell me what happened yesterday. And Pozzo responds, quote, "Have you not done tormenting me with your accursed time? It's abominable. When? One day. Is that not enough for you? One day he went dumb. One day I went blind. One day we'll go deaf. One day we were born. One day we shall die. The same day, the same second. Is that not enough for you? They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more." End quote. Life is so short, goes by so fast. We're born, we go blind, we go dumb, we go deaf, and we die. Thanks for watching.